Please welcome Patrick Kehoe, Executive Vice President of Product Management at Messagepoint. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And there was a great roundtable discussion that you guys just have. I'm going to be talking today about how you can improve customer experience based upon the customer communications. And what we see for a lot of financial services organizations is those customer communications is a primary mechanism that they use to reach and talk to their customers, and how that content can help support those experiences and help drive that better customer experience. So I'm Patrick Kehoe. I lead the product management team here at Messagepoint. In true COVID fashion, my neighbors have started roofing their house today, and they live about 10 feet away from me. So I'm hoping that you won't hear a lot of background noise. If you do, I apologize for that. To get started here, Messagepoint is a content and customer communications management software that uses AI and other processes to help create and improve better personalized customer communications and experiences across all platforms and channels. And we service some of the largest financial services and insurance companies, predominantly in North America, but recent expansion in Europe and in Asia Pacific. What we've seen through this last year is COVID has really impacted almost everything that we do, whether it be people that are not coming to specific branches, to having to do all of these types of meetings through Zoom or webinar type experiences, to people doing more transactions electronically and really less cash purchases, and then to really the adoption of mobile and digital experiences. And what we see is a real strong focus on those customer experience areas of focus, whether it be problem resolution or service changes, the onboarding activities, the in-person transactions that still need to be done, or the sign-up activities. All of these, whether they're part of the acquisition journey or whether they're part of the service journey, all of them have a communications aspect that covers as part of that process. And we see that all of these changes need to be effectively communicated and engaged with the customers when you're creating that process, when you're resolving that problem, when you're onboarding a customer. And how do we look to those communications to create a better experience and to ultimately represent your organization in the best possible way? What we've further seen with COVID is a big change around the customer behavior. You know, when we started the process, people were having their groceries delivered to their door. They were washing everything, letting it sit for 72 hours. That world has changed. You don't necessarily need to do that. The vaccines are opening things up in the process, and we're seeing changes as part of this world. But the reality is that post-COVID-19 is a digital reality. We're seeing that more than ever, people are not necessarily returning to the branches in the same way that they did before. In April of last year, we saw a 200% jump in new mobile banking registrations, and mobile banking traffic rose by 85%, according to Fidelity National Information Services, a big service provider for the spaces, and that has continued throughout the entire pandemic. So the opportunity is to say, how do you provide a better experience across that digital world? The stress is still there. Customers, even through this entire process, have been having a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress about this process. As the vaccines have gotten rolled out, as we've deployed more of this technology and these works, that some of that stress has gone down, but it is still an ever-present component in people's day-to-day life. And how can their interaction and engagement with financial services organizations help to reduce that stress? What we see is that the nature of this process has created more churn. Historically, people expected that they were going to see about a 12% churn, but through this pandemic, they're expecting that churn rate could go up to as much as 22 to 27%. This is based upon data that we're seeing from Forrester and as they surveyed banking customers. And some of the primary drivers for that were declining customer sat, but also fees and costs. So what we want to focus on today is some tips on how to improve your customer communications programs, starting with personalization and relevancy, going through to the sentiment and the content that goes into those communications to make sure that it's empathetic, to provide the consistency and uniformity across those different channels so that you can make sure that you're speaking with one voice as you communicate to your customers, because almost everything is a multi-channel journey. And then ultimately, how to accelerate the responses. How do you make sure that you're timely in getting back to customers and addressing their concerns? So first, when we start with this, it's about hyper-personalization. It's how do you provide that data and how do you make sure that you're tailoring your communication specifically to that communicator. As we heard in the last round table, having that message that speaks directly to those people and to their needs is really key in that process. So if you're promoting a home equity line of credit, how can you make sure that you tailor that message and the graphics and the tone and the content of those communications for those different audiences? If you've got somebody that you're working with that is trying to understand the customer, those conversations that may have started out as a chatbot but evolved into a conversation with one of your agents, how do you look through those processes and use that information about what you know to the customer to create a better experience? In this situation here, we have John, whose daughter has been accepted into an elite university. He had budgeted for a state school. This is going to cost him $50,000 a year more than what he expected. He's super excited for his daughter, but he didn't really have the technology, or I'm sorry, the investment to be able to support this type of transition. So in his discussions with Jane, it was identified that John has an opportunity to take advantage of the equity that he has in his home to help address some of those imminent needs that he needs for that college education. So the opportunity to create a personalized message that talks to John specifically on what he's doing, takes into consideration that communication, and able to craft back in a specific email to give him the information that he needs is key. The opportunity to further hyper-personalize that, to take that information and really memorialize and capture the conversation that they had, to know that Jane listened and responded and added that very personal touch into that communication, is a way to be able to drive that hyper-personalization. We see the same thing when people are creating those types of standard service communications. Oftentimes, organizations are creating a very bland, your statement is ready email to people. You know, sometimes these things look like they came out in 1970 or 1980, and it is nothing but a link back to your website. And it's no wonder that people aren't clicking through those communications because they don't see any value in that process. Yes, you may have moved them off of paper, but you're not really creating a really good digital experience for them as part of that process. So the opportunity is to create a richer experience as part of that. You know, you might bring in some branding process and you might make it so you're providing a more attractive looking communication. But the real opportunity is being able to create a communication that is personalized and relevant and delivers the information of value. So if you take that YSIR and you add things like their current balance and when their payment is due, and you provide that basic information that doesn't really impact their PII or the privacy of their account, but you give them that information that makes it so that that is very specific to them, then A, they're likely to read the communication in the first place. And then by providing personalization and relevant content that helps them in a soft sell or in a collaborative process and how they can better understand their financial processes to get additional advice anywhere, you make it so that your brand and your process is more relevant to the customer. And that means that people are paying attention to those communications, they're getting value for them, and they're more likely to engage with your brand and click through to those things to do more. Part of that process is making sure that you've got the right content that goes into those communications. One of the things that the financial brand identified is speed and simplicity as a top customer experience trend for 2021, and that they see that the simplicity and speed of the engagement is key to that process. How do you provide the right information to people to make it so that their communications are well understood? This is about making sure that the message is received and understood. And what we see for a lot of organizations is they get tied up in the jargon and the technical acronyms and other components as part of their communications. As part of a study done from the PIAAC, they found that the average grade levels that are used for organizations to reach 77% of the population needs to be at a 4 to 5 grade level, whereas most organizations are targeting a grade 8 to 9 reading level, but in reality, and many times are creating their communications at a grade 10, 11, or 12. So the opportunity is how can you create a communication that makes it so that people understand what you're creating, so that you use those short words and those clear and concise languages, and you don't try to over communicate that information and make it so that people feel that you're talking above their head. There's a delicate balance in that process from a readability perspective to avoid those technical jargons, to make it so that you don't create super complex sentences and avoid those polysyllabic words, but it's making it so you've got the right content at the right level to support that engagement and that communication. One of the things that we do with our process is to make it so we bring that readability front and center while people are authoring those communications. So while we're creating this particular email, either as part of a template or as part of a one-off, we provide guidance in that, and we tell them that your content that you're creating right now is for ages 13 to 15, so that you're writing at a college level. So we show you that content and make it really easy for you to adjust that content in that process, to be able to rewrite not only the bulleted text here, but also the content above that, and take the whole communication down to a grade 5 level, which really helps you to get that better target for the customer. Now, the other part of this process is the emotions that go into that. How is the communications that you're creating make people feel? And when we think about this, what happens is oftentimes people end up having negative emotion, especially in either low intensity or high intensity communications, which can ultimately either reduce their share of or risk their share of wallet or weaken their affinity. That means that you actually have the chance to lose customers when you use that negative content in those communications. But if you bring positive emotions and positive sentiment in that, especially in those high intensity communications, you can grow that share of wallet. So as examples of that, being able to identify where you have positive and negative emotions is key in this process. So you can use that information to talk about whether you're declining somebody and you're telling them that they're an unsuitable candidate for the scoring system. No one wants to be told that they're unsuitable. The opportunity is to turn that from a negative sentiment to perhaps a neutral sentiment that just says they couldn't accept you, or better yet, to talk about this in a positive way that basically reflects that we're not blaming you for your criteria not suiting us, but we would love to work with you as we go forward. Part of that process is looking at the languages that go into the communications, making sure that you've got the right words and the right process there. So if you're talking about things like unsuitable, you want to not use those words, and being able to highlight and showcase those words in that process and say, these are not part of the communication. You should remove these types of things in your engagements. So the ability to proactively identify where you've got those brand compliance issues when you're writing your content. When we look at the consistency and uniformity of communications, that's where some real opportunities come from. Part of that is also from a perspective of brand, looking at the visual identity of those communications, the colors, the fonts, the layouts, the information, and the words. It's making sure that you've got the right information that goes into those documents so you convey trust with your customers and how you engage with them. We see this is a key component in making sure that you've got consistency and that people feel that they can trust the documents and the communications that you're getting. One of the things that we've seen is that through the COVID times, we saw people oftentimes outsource some of these communications to a service provider that didn't follow the same brand compliance and guidelines, and oftentimes didn't even use the same domain name for sending those messages. And those create a real fear for customers that your messages are phishing, that there's not legitimate. Now, hopefully nobody would actually use Comic Sans in creating their communications, but providing that consistency in that process and being able to align to your brand standards is key, and making sure that the people trust every document, every communication, every email that's coming out of your process. But for many organizations, this process is challenging because there's different teams responsible for managing that content across each of those different channels. You've got some people that are creating the print communications for those customers that are still getting documents in that way, different teams that are doing your email and SMS, and still other teams that are using different tools and processes to create your new emerging channels like your chat bots and your intelligent voice assistants. So how do you provide continuity across those channels in order to provide a better customer experience? That incongruity can create a real challenge. If we look at this situation here where there's a credit card coverage and they're talking about the car rental coverage, we see that in the mobile experience or the web experience, it's one piece of content, different content that comes in the credit card's terms and conditions, and yet different content again that shows up in the statement as part of that process. That inconsistent brand voice makes it hard for people to address your organization and to trust the content and the messaging that they're getting. And it also creates concern from a regulatory and a compliance standpoint because you're giving them different messages. Which message is the right message? And if they looked at only one of these communications online, is that the one that they're going to look at? We see that how to address this is to provide a content hub. Manage your content in a single place that can provide consistency across those teams and channels so that you can deliver the same message or the same authoring process for that message, regardless of whether it's a disclosure, a marketing message, or an educational content, and do that consistently across all the different channels and engagement. Where possible, you want to look at that content and actually reuse the content across those channels. But it's also the opportunity to create content that might be a different rendition. What you say when you write something on your email might be different when you send the same message into an SMS or part of a web page. But if the authors are authoring that content at the same time, then they can make sure that they've got the consistency in sharing that content and that message across those different channels. The last area is how do you accelerate your responses? When we look at many organizations, their communications across the financial service spectrum are many and varied. And it becomes hard to be able to create those communications and respond effectively to new product services or changes in the climate or the business. What we see is that it's oftentimes an IT-centric authoring process. There's developers that are required to do this work. And that slows down the process because it requires programming to do that. It requires lots of back and forth that occurs between the different parties. And then you also have multiple people that are doing the work. So you run into the potential risk to have inconsistencies that sneak into the communications as part of that process. And this is especially rampant when you're trying to do this consistently across different channels without a content hub. What we see in many organizations is they do this process where this work gets scheduled, it gets into the queue to be worked on, the developer actually makes the change, they go through a regression testing, they validate whether that was done correctly. And each of those steps takes significant time and money to do that. It's not unusual as we look to financial services customers for them to take 6 weeks to 12 weeks to make even the simplest changes in the process. A better way is to make it so that the business user actually makes the change themselves. They make that change, they can self-validate that across the specific channels that they want to see that in. They can make sure that it looks correct in their output, and then they can sign off or route that through an approval process before it gets moved into production. And we've seen financial services companies take processes that used to take 12 weeks down to take 1 hour to make a change. And that's a huge win for them as they're trying to do the work, not only because of the time and effort that it's spent, but it's the ability to react and change with the speed of the business. We see the same thing around that content sharing is that when you make that change and you make it all at once, it makes it really efficient to be able to deploy that across all your different engagements. So making sure you've got the right message there and that it's consistently applied and deployed. The other part of that speed process is some of those ad hoc communications. If you're creating something that is done on a one-off basis, if you interact with a customer and you have to find that right template, you have to adjust the content to make that offer, you create any customizations and you send it. You can do those things without technologies and tools, but it's messy. People are looking at documents that are stored on different file servers or on their own desktop. They've got a mishmash of places. They're doing swivel chair data entry by copying and pasting things from one system into another, and you're having to do all that work in a traditional tool like Microsoft Word or email. A better approach to this is to centralize that document repository in the creation of those communications so that you can personalize that instance of that communication in one point. Whether you're taking that data from your CRM system or from your core banking system, pulling that information in and adjusting that, and then being able to tailor that particular communication for the recipient is key in creating that really deep, personalized, hyper-personalized experience, but doing that as efficiently as you could before with your process, or even more efficiently by not having to find those different tools. And that's really an opportunity to help create deeper personalized communications. Sometimes there's the desire to just do everything as a straight-through processing, no hands, no touching it. But if you can have the same speed that you would do and personalize and memorialize that conversation, you build that deeper relationship with your most valued customers, and you can make sure that they know that you're talking to them as an individual. You recognize them as a person. So to recap those tips, aim for hyper-personalization and relevancy, optimize the clarity and the sentiment in the communications, provide uniformity and consistency, and accelerate or speed up the process that you're using to create those communications. When we look at how to get started on these things today, one of the first steps is to look for your existing communications. Look for those inconsistencies that you have across those processes and find a portion of that customer journey that you want to use to help improve and optimize that work. You don't have to boil the ocean. Starting to make changes to a small piece of the process is key in this work. When you start to assess your systems and look at whether you've got access to the data and the information to be able to facilitate that. Do you have the ability to segment the information for your audiences? Can you manage your offers differently across each channel? Can you provide self-service capabilities for those ad hoc and interactive communications? And then lastly, you need to establish your goals here. So when you map out your goals and you understand the work that you're trying to do, you can create a process that makes it easy for you to understand the work that you're going to. When you look at what those goals and that strategy is, again, you're trying to find something that gives you quick wins and look for those opportunities. Are your offers worded appropriately given today's climate? And then from there, build your roadmap. Look at how you can take these activities and identify if you need new tools or technologies to be able to address these problems. How can you streamline and run pilot programs to be able to look at the different approaches? And how can you bring in other teams like your marketing teams to help you with the collaboration and how to be able to address those processes? This is not one team. This is something that has the opportunity to go across the business. So for Messagepoint, we provide that centralized content and communications hub, one place for you to manage your communications in the environment and to be able to deliver that content to a variety of different systems. And we support that in two different ways. One is helping people to migrate and optimize their communications. One of the things that we've seen over the last number of years is people struggle with adopting new technology because they have no way to get the information out of those old systems. And that's where Rationalizer comes in for us. It's an automated tool that uses AI and machine learning to help us extract the content from your legacy systems or from your Word documents or PDF files and be able to understand that content, to look for the opportunities to consolidate and remove the duplicates in that content to make it so you have fewer content that's under management. And then ultimately to migrate that information into the destination system. Messagepoint, we believe, is the right system for that content and communications hub to make it so you can intelligently manage that content with our patented variation management process and our AI assistants to be able to point out issues with respect to readability or sentiment, brand compliance, or even identify if something that you're writing right now is a duplicate of something else that you had done before. And then we can send that information on to the different delivery and content assembly systems or be able to create the communications directly. All of these things are powered by what we call MARCI, the Messagepoint Advanced Rationalization and Content Intelligence Engine. It's our AI and machine learning content intelligence process that helps us to optimize that content. So I hope I've given you some thoughts and some ideas on how you might be able to improve and engage with your customers in a better way, especially around those customer communications, regardless of channels. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to take those things now.
Well, we do have a couple questions for you in the chat. So thank you, Patrick, for your presentation. The first question is from Patricia Poley. How do you ensure an effective E2E communication strategy, including the collections part of the customer journey?
So that's ultimately what this whole process is. So the efficient end-to-end communications journey is the result of this. Some of that starts out by mapping your customer journey and looking at those data collection points and how that information is going to flow into the communications process. It's how you're going to build a building. You start one brick at a time. You're going to look at that process and look at your different communications and try to map that across those activities and make sure that you're engaging with the different stakeholders in the business. One of the things that's particularly important, as you mentioned, is the capture process is how do you make sure that you're interfacing with the teams that are doing the capture as well as creating the communications in the first place, because it's a symbiotic relationship. If you send bad information to the consumer, then they're going to not fill out your forms correctly. They're not going to enter the information correctly. If you enter the information correctly, then you move the process forward much faster. And that's how you compress and take the time out of the entire cycle.
All right. Other questions here. Oh, this is a good one, because you had that fancy Marcy thing there that uses AI and machine learning to magically get things migrated over. How can a not so digitally agile organization use Messagepoint to communicate?
So we have many organizations that are using us for their traditional communications. Everybody has aspirations for digital, but the majority of financial services companies are still sending a lot of their communications through traditional channels, through print and mail or through PDFs that are hosted through their website. Messagepoint can help you to streamline and automate that process, but also to make it so that you can then help transition those communications over into a digital event or digital vein. So it's not uncommon for us to work with financial services firms that are trying to start that migration, and that we help them to unlock that content from those old systems and bring them into a modern communication system and make it really easy to create both the traditional communications as well as digital ones.
All right, great. Next question, Michelle Gray asked, when using the Content Hub, how do you ensure that the content is appropriate for the medium being used? I'm thinking about customer expectations for language changes between mediums. SMS can be more casual than a letter should be.
Absolutely. So I think that's one of the key things that you need to decide as your organization. Are you going to have the same brand style, the same type of process that you use across channels? Or are you going to create a consistency where you bring that same casual style to your email or to your website? So if you want those to be different, tools like Messagepoint can help manage that process and give you the ability to have different controls for different types of output formats. Or if you want them to be the same, it can help identify and promote where you've got those differences and help you to raise the issues across those that content and help you to streamline that and bring it into compliance.
All right. So one of the things that is true in today's world is there are so many systems. There's your core banking system, or if you're a insurance company, there's your billing and your claim systems. And does your solution just stand alone, or does it integrate with all of those different core systems?
In every one of our customers, our solution integrates with those different types of systems. And then we also have the ability to provide our own composition and communication capabilities, or to integrate in with their existing technology that they may already have. So if you already have an investment in a CCM technology or in an electronic delivery tool, we can complement those instead of having to replace them. And obviously, of course, you have to link into those core banking systems or into the core CRM systems, because that's the data that feeds these processes. But we recognize and look forward to the opportunity to leverage existing investments that people have and to incrementally improve that process.
All right. Quick clarification on a previous question is, what about collections communications for customers that have fallen past due? How do you interact with that, and how do you use this to manage that process?
Absolutely. We have a number of customers who are using us for collections communications and supporting their either revenue cycle management or their other types of processes. And those letters are a great fit for this process, because we can help to provide standardized content that you use across those activities. We have a number of service providers that are using our tools to help create those types of correspondence and communications. The one thing that's different there is collection letters are one of those communications that oftentimes people don't want electronically. So your mic can end up still resorting to print and mail for those processes. And we absolutely support both of those types of activities as well as digital. And where people are willing to move to digital, you can take advantage of those channels to send the same content to them.
All right, fantastic. Patrick, thank you so much for your presentation. For those of you watching, please visit the Messagepoint booth. They have some great people manning it that have answers to your questions. So go ahead, and in a little while, we're going to have a networking session where you could jump on and go to the Messagepoint booth and talk to people there.
Thank you so much.